Just a warning before we start, this episode contains discussion of sexual abuse and trauma, which some listeners may find distressing. I'm Laura Murphy-Oates, and this is The Full Story.
That day is a day that I will never forget. It's just like it happened yesterday.
This is 62-year-old Barry Kennedy. He is a member of the Carry the Kettle First Nation in Saskatchewan, Canada. The events that he is remembering here took place in 1964, but are still fresh in his mind.
We were just sitting there with my mom and my dad in our house. It was wood heated. We had no running water. We hauled water in the summertime and we hauled snow in the wintertime. And we were sitting there one morning just getting ready to have breakfast. And all of a sudden there was a knock on the door and my dad yelled across the room, "Just come on in," thinking it was a relative, and in stepped an RCMP officer.
The police officer came into Barry's home, followed by a group of people that included members of the church. They were there to take Barry and his two sisters to one of Canada's residential schools for Indigenous children.
My mother had taken us children that were in the kitchen to another room and told us to stay there. She then left us and went back into the kitchen, and everybody started yelling. You can hear my mother's begin to cry. You can begin to hear the arguments, the begging, the demands.
In the more than 150 years that residential schools run by the Catholic Church were operational, thousands of children were forced to attend them by the Canadian state.
My great-grandfather was an Indian residential school survivor. My grandparents were Indian residential school survivors. My mother was an Indian residential school survivor. And so my mother knew what could possibly happen to us. And to this day, I always think back on that moment when we were taken from our home, from our mother and our father, and we were thrown into the backseat of a car. Me and my two sisters driving off, all we could do was try to console one another, try to hold one another, because we were scared. We were confused. We didn't know who we were with. We didn't know where we were going. I was 5 years old. It was just, that whole incident hurts the most because it was the beginning of a journey that still controls my life today.
Last month, the remains of hundreds of children were discovered at the sites of former residential schools across Canada. It's expected that many more will be found. At the school that Barry was sent to, Maryville, 751 graves were uncovered. None of the bodies have yet been identified. For survivors like Barry, this news came as no surprise. But it has forced Canada into a new reckoning with the darkest chapters of its history and the continued injustices that First Nations people there struggle against every day. Today, the Indigenous children abducted by the Canadian state and buried in unmarked graves. It's Monday, the 12th of July. Rachel Humphreys is the presenter of Today in Focus, where this episode first aired.
Leyland Checo, you report for The Guardian from Toronto, and you've been writing about the discovery of unmarked graves on the sites of Indigenous schools. We've heard from Barry about the generations of his family who were forced to attend them after they were established in the 1830s. Why were they set up in the first place?
To understand why these schools were set up, you kind of have to look at Canada as a colonial country. It was settled by British and French powers, but Canada was not an open, vast, unpopulated land. It had hundreds and thousands of communities across the country whose territory spanned hundreds of kilometers, where they would often move for hunting depending on the season. But it was also abundant with natural resources. And that's what the government at the time saw as being incredibly valuable. And they saw Indigenous peoples as a barrier to accessing those vast resources.
Tell me about the part that residential schools played in the government's attempt to take control of Indigenous territory.
The federal government, on a number of occasions, tried to negotiate with Indigenous nations, and they signed treaties in some areas. Other times they used the brute force of the state to continue its push throughout the country. But they saw schools as a tool of effectively cutting off a generation of indigeneity. And so they recognized that the church had, for a long time, worked to convert Indigenous communities to Christianity because they saw a lot of their beliefs as being pagan and these communities in need of salvation in the idea of the church. And the federal government saw that as an incredibly effective, if not brutal, when we look back at it now, tool of making these Indigenous children into what they wanted, which was Canadian, a Western Christian child.
They have a total of 11,000 pupils, orphans, convalescents, those who live too far in the wilderness to get to a daily school. They learn not only games and traditions, such as the celebration of St. Valentine's Day, but the mastery of words, which will open to them the whole range of the ordinary Canadian curriculum.
You've got to recognize that when these children arrived at school, many of them never spoke English or French. They would speak the languages that they'd grown up with. They would have spoken Ojibwe, they would have spoken Cree. They dressed the way that their parents and their grandparents had, that they had a belief system that had passed down for thousands of years. All of that was in direct confrontation for what the state wanted.
These schools were portrayed as being for the Indigenous children's own benefit, but it sounds like the opposite, both for them and presumably for their families.
There's a particularly damning detail that we know about the schools, which was that when they were built, they were placed in locations that were deliberately far away from the families and the communities of the children attending. Because the idea was that if you could remove them from their families, if you could remove them physically from their homes, that you had an effective tool in effectively severing that connection they had both to their culture, their community, and their family. The government also used a pass system on reserves, which required people gain permission to leave the reserve to visit children in these schools. And so many kids didn't see their family for a long time. And that was a very deliberate structure of these schools, which was to sever children from all that they knew before they'd entered the school.
After Barry was torn away from his family, he was taken to Marival Indian Residential School, an imposing 4-story building on the windswept plains of Saskatchewan. The school closed in 1997, and the building has since been demolished. But Barry still remembers his first day there vividly.
There was a line of boys going up the stairs. At the first level is where we were stripped of all our clothes. So it was the first time of being naked in front of everybody, and everybody was trying to hide their privates from one another. And it wasn't just all 5-year-old boys. Some were teenagers. A lot of people were crying. There's a lot of confusion in your mind. And we got up to the second level, and they began to shave our heads. They used handheld clippers and scissors, and I had nice long hair. My dad used to be pretty proud of my hair because it was long and it was curly. And, you know, when they were finished, there was little clumps of hair here and there. And you're still confused. You're still wondering, like, what happened to my parents? Because our traditional ways is, depending on how short you cut your hair, you're losing a family member. And we were cut right to the scalp. So in our traditional ways, it meant that our family had died. So that's how we understood it. And then from there, we were given our number. My number at Marival Indian Residential School was 167. So that had to mean there was 166 boys before me.
Did you know where you'd been taken at this point, Barry? I mean, it sounds like a prison, the way that you were treated.
Yeah. I've been to prison, and we were treated pretty good there. This was more of a torture camp. Anytime that we spoke without being asked to speak, we were slapped. Anytime we did anything that wasn't asked of us, we were punched. anytime we looked at one another or cried, we were kicked. And, those were the loving touches. The worst stuff was still yet to come. I was at Maryvale for 5 years. During the day, it was like any other school. We had recesses, we had lunch, we played ball, we flew kites. But it was the nights where the real trouble started.
What do you mean?
Well, we were all in one big dormitory, and off to one side of the dormitory was where they called him the keeper. And it was someone who stayed in the dorm that night and made his rounds to make sure everybody was safe, make sure everybody was good. And it wasn't all the keepers, it was just a couple of them that when them particular keepers were on, and that door would open, you would hear boys begin to cry. You would hear the moaning. To hear fear, to see fear. Because boys that were there previous, they knew what was going to happen, and I didn't know. It was my first few nights there. One night it was my turn. I was taken. Me too, I cried like everybody else. I didn't know what I was crying for. Got into that room and used to have this little white and yellow striped pajamas, and they were always really warm and stuff, and that was the comfort. And you get into that room, and when I first got into that room, I said, "What the heck is good? I don't know what people are always crying for." I was on the floor, and the guy come and sat with me and started talking to me and asked me if I wanted marbles. And so he said he was going to get me some marbles. And then it was, he asked me to come onto the bed. And so I did. And then, it was...
You don't need to say any more, Barry, if you don't want to, because what you said is more than enough, and I appreciate it's a very, very difficult thing to talk about.
Still today, you try to cope with what took place in that room.
The discovery last month of hundreds of unmarked graves at Maryvale School has forced Barry to confront memories of the awful abuse he suffered and of the friends who just disappeared. Some died from malnutrition, others from disease. But for many families who lost loved ones, they will never know what really happened to their children.
I was an altar boy. I was one of them guys that they made me help this priest. It was our responsibility every Sunday to go down and to the church and dress up in these little robes and assist the priest in the service. Well, this one morning, we were called out early in the morning. They come and got us out of our beds. And they said we had to report to the church. So I went down and I got my little robe on and went and found a priest, and he followed him outside. When we got outside, there was a hole that was dug there. And there was a body wrapped in a sheet. Right, and so the priest performed his last rites. And it wasn't even in a coffin, it was just in a sheet and thrown in the ground.
Whose body was it, Barry?
I don't know.
Was it a child?
Yeah, it was a child, yeah.
Oh, gosh. Oh, my God.
I had this friend, his name is Brian. And him and I were like buds, right? We're like really good friends, probably best friends. We spent our days together and we slept together in the same dorm. He wasn't that far from me. And played marbles together, and we did everything together. And one night, one of the keepers, they took him.
What?
They took him, and he never ever came back.
So one morning you woke up and your friend Brian just wasn't there anymore?
Well, I watched them take him. Right here in a dorm, everybody watches. And they took him, and he never ever came back. The things that we endured, it was everything inhumane that you can do to a person took place in them schools. Can you imagine the high rates of kids running away and suicides and kids dying from loneliness and from starvation? And some of them kids probably died of just fear alone.
A developing story out of British Columbia. A First Nation says the remains of more than 200 children have been located.
Les résultats des recherches sont préliminaires, mais ils confirment le pire.
The first mass graves were announced at the end of May, and that news hit the country hard. And within a little more than a month, 3 schools have announced that they found effectively more than 1,100 unmarked graves at the site of former residential schools.
For Canada's Indigenous people, it's another tragic but not unexpected moment. Less than a month after the remains of 215 children were found in British Columbia, more unmarked graves uncovered at another Catholic residential school in Saskatchewan province.
For Indigenous communities, this isn't a surprise. This is something they've been saying for years existed. This is something they've been pleading for years to have funding to uncover. And so while the country is surprised, survivors of these schools are frustrated because their voices have been muffled and muted and silenced for generations.
Okay, so for many people, this discovery and recognition of what happened has been a very long time coming. Most of these schools closed in the 90s. When did Canada first begin to acknowledge the abuse, though, that had taken place in these schools?
Canada really had to confront the residential school system for the first time as a country in the early 2000s, and that's when the federal government issued its first apology.
The government now recognizes that the consequences of the Indian residential schools policy were profoundly negative.
And that apology came with, for a number of survivors, a financial settlement, a recognition from the state that it had been complicit in a system that had been meant to both suppress and destroy indigeneity. And as a part of that settlement, there was the creation of what was called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Thousands of survivors made difficult journeys to testify in front of the commission, to share their story, to share what happened to them in these schools. And for so many, it required that they relive the trauma that they've had buried within them for generations. Some said it had a healing effect to know that their stories were finally documented as testimony of what happened in these schools. But for many, it just highlighted the hurt, the shame, the anger, the fear that they've had to suffer through for generations.
The head of the commission, Justice Murray Sinclair, opened the closing ceremony with a message for the boy who drummed in the participants.
I want you to sing loud and do that forever, my young friend, so that people will come to realize what could have always been because of you.
It took 7 years for the commission to gather evidence. What did it conclude?
When the Truth and Reconciliation Commission gave their final report, they concluded that if you add the summation of the school, if you look at the intent of the school, the way the schools were administered, it amounted to cultural genocide. And when that finding hit, it rocked a lot of the country. But I had the honor of speaking with Murray Sinclair, who is the chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report. And he pointed out that in many ways, the commission was hamstrung in one particular thing, and that was investigating the deaths associated with the school. The mandate was narrow enough that they couldn't really probe into what happened to these children. And so the finding of cultural genocide is largely a function of the fact that they couldn't really fully investigate the actions of the church and of the state in these schools. And a lot of people have said, and I think with a lot of evidence, that we might take out the word cultural on that when we finally get an investigation into what happened in those schools.
The commission came up with 94 recommendations. How many of them were actually adopted?
Of those 94, it's generous to say 6 or 7 have actually been formally implemented. And when communities asked for the first time to the federal government for money to fund the search for those unmarked graves, they were turned down. And it's only because these nations across the country have been so persistent for years to find their loved ones that we finally are seeing the results of those searches. So I think that's also an important thing to kind of couch the shock that we're seeing now, is that there's largely been complacency for the last 6 years since the Truth and Reconciliation's final report came out about what Canada can be doing to mend its broken relationship with Indigenous communities.
Barry, can you tell me a bit about how being at Merivale School for those 5 years affected you? You didn't see your parents or your sisters at all for the time that you were there. What was it like to finally return home?
I didn't know what mother and father meant anymore. When I got home, my mother tried to rekindle that relationship, but of course I was already angry. I was already quite disturbed, and I was still, why did you let me go there? You know, I really regret that feeling.
Oh, no, maybe you shouldn't feel like that. I mean, this whole thing was about severing communities, and that was not your guilt to bear.
Yeah, but I feel I still, she was my mother, and I didn't give her the respect that she needed until, late in life. And, but they were patient with me. I went off, and before I was 14 years old, I was on my own. I was out in the world trying to hurt somebody. I wasn't the person that you wanted to know. I was that person that everybody was scared of. I was that person that had issues with alcohol and with drugs. I was a very mean person. I was incarcerated twice in my life. The first time I got to jail, I was so scared to go there. But when they took me in there, I was happy because everybody in there was from the residential school. We have the highest homeless population. We have the highest suicide rates, the highest incarceration. And it's all because of Indian residential school, what these guys did.
And Leyland has told us about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and how that gave some Indigenous people the chance to talk about what had happened to them. You took part in that. What was that like for you?
Pardon my French, but that was all bullshit.
Why?
There was an adjudicator, there was a member from the Canadian government, and my lawyer and myself. And the representative from Canada, the only time he talked was to say that I wasn't a credible witness. Well, I guess not a credible witness. I'm 5 years old. You know what I mean?
He said you weren't a credible witness because of your age when that happened.
Yeah.
Gosh. 28,000 victims were paid compensation as a result of the commission. Were you given any money?
I got compensated, not even enough to buy a vehicle.
How did it feel for someone else to put a price on what you had been through?
That's the most degrading part of this. And no one ever gets charged. 5,312 people were identified as committed harms on Indigenous children. And this was in 2012. And those were the ones that were living. And so they went and they talked to them, asked them if they wanted to stand up and defend themselves. And they all said no. I'm so angry, right?
Yeah. Who do you feel angry towards? I mean, so many people, agencies caught up in this.
Well, I'm real angry with the justice system. I'm real angry with society that we're always people that we can push away, that we can sweep underneath the rug. And that's what they tried to do with all that money. They tried to sweep this underneath the rug. And everything did go quiet. It went quiet for about 5 years. But a lot of ceremonies, a lot of prayers were said. And finally, these ones that had lost their lives said, it's our turn to speak. And they showed themselves.
When those unmarked graves were discovered at Merivale School, you actually went back there, Barry. What was that like?
I needed to go back. I spent the day down there. I walked amongst all them markers. that represented graves. And I cried, tears fell down my face. And to me, it was important that I survived and important that I talk. I take this not to try and degrade myself, but I take it as an honor because all them children out there at Maryvale Indian Residential School that are in that gravesite, those are my alumni. And I have to speak to ensure that this will never, ever happen again. And no children will ever be taken again like this.
Next, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau responds, and Barry discusses how he has rebuilt his life since leaving the Maryvale School.
Leyland, there has been a huge response across Canada to this story. Last Thursday was Canada Day, ordinarily a moment of national pride for many, but this time it was very much overshadowed by the discovery of these graves.
A sign of solidarity. Thousands take to the streets, demanding recognition, reconciliation, and so much more.
We've seen churches defaced and burned down.
In the early hours of the morning, members of the Penticton Indian Band spotted flames as a Catholic church burned to the ground.
And statues of Queen Victoria and Queen Elizabeth II pulled to the ground. A reminder of Britain's own colonial legacy. What has Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said in response to all of this?
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has issued a number of statements of mourning, of grief, ever since the first graves were discovered in late May.
Indigenous communities across this country have my commitment that they will get the resources necessary to recover and document as much as possible these kids in these graves.
He said this is Canada's dark history, it's Canada's shame. But there have been calls for the Prime Minister to do a bit more, to show that the government is honestly considering an outcome that would provide truth and closure for communities. And for a lot of people, that takes the form of an independent, government-free investigation into what happened in the schools. It represents the government's willingness to potentially have its own culpability exposed in the legacy of these schools. And so far, the Prime Minister is not committed to any investigation. He hasn't ruled it out, but he hasn't said that that will be a priority for his government. And so I think for a lot of people, it's been tricky to figure out where the government really stands on moving forward.
I mean, in Justin Trudeau's case, what is the extent of that culpability? I mean, he's been Prime Minister since 2015. In that time, what has he done to improve the lives of Indigenous people in Canada? And you've reported on these communities for several years, haven't you?
I have. One of the survivors that I spoke with said he doesn't blame Justin Trudeau. He recognizes that Justin Trudeau inherited the legacy of these schools, but it wasn't Justin Trudeau who abused him at these schools. But at the same time, it's impossible to look at this situation and not look at how the federal government has fostered a relationship with Indigenous communities that is profoundly premised on notions of inequity. And the Prime Minister has taken steps to remedy a number of inequities. But this is 2021 in Canada. It's one of the wealthiest countries in the world. And it's one of the most water wealthy countries in the world. But there are 34 First Nations across the country that don't have access to clean drinking water. Justin Trudeau's government has been locked in court battles with the survivors of residential day schools over compensation for years. Justin Trudeau's government has been in court fighting a human rights tribunal ruling that is obliged to compensate Indigenous children who are abused and taken from families in the foster care system. And in recent years, the country has also had to grapple with the fact that Indigenous women are far more likely to be killed than any other group in the country, that thousands of women and girls have gone missing in this country. And for many, they see government policy and government inaction as directly complicit in this tragedy. And so Canada's relationship with Indigenous peoples isn't just the dark and brutal colonial past, it's also a present in which government policy profoundly shapes the ability for Indigenous communities to thrive and survive.
Over 1,000 unmarked graves have been discovered, Leyland. Will there be more?
There will be more. There will be more unmarked graves discovered in the coming weeks, in the coming months, and in the coming years. When I was working on a story last week about the latest discovery at one of the residential schools, I was struck by the fact that the official tally of deaths at St. Eugene's was 19 children. That community has uncovered 182 unmarked graves. If even a portion of those are children who attended that school, there's still a lot of question about who those children were. Why weren't their deaths recorded? When the Truth and Reconciliation Commission issued its report in 2015, it estimated there were around 4,100 children who died in these schools. When I spoke with Murray Sinclair, the former head of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, he said previously that it could be as high as 15,000.
Wow. This is so shocking, Leyland, and so confronting for Canada to reckon with as a nation. But considering the recent history, do you think this will actually be a turning point towards actual change for Indigenous people?
It feels as though this issue, the recognition of these unmarked graves being uncovered, feels fundamentally different than other times in which Canada has had to grapple with the legacies of its colonial past and the policies of its government in the present day. But that's just one part of the challenge. And Murray Sinclair told me, on the one hand, you have the truth, and that's what we have to endeavor towards as much as we can. But you also have the reconciliation aspect, and that's where the heavy lifting comes. The effort that's required by Canadians and the institutions of the state to make fundamental change to how they view Indigenous communities and their actions towards those communities. And so I think that while it feels good to be hopeful that there is change coming, it's a pretty steep hill to climb, a pretty high mountain, as Murray Sinclair put it, to get to reconciliation.
Barry, we talked about the commission and how very little came out of that. What do you want to happen now? You're very bravely speaking up. There are others who are speaking up as well. What would you like to see happen? What change?
I think before we get to that, we have to determine who these kids are. Canada needs to be in a time of mourning for all these kids. They've never had them final ceremonies. They never had them songs. I think all of them things need to take place. And for all these grave sites that have been found, the big job is still yet to come, because who were they? How did they die?
I just wanted to say that I can't believe what you've been through and the strength that you have. And you must be so proud. You have a family and you have so many children around you, and you're clearly such a warm person. How you reflect on how you've managed to build all of that incredible life around you despite everything that happened.
I give most of the respect to my wife. My wife is very caring. She is my strength. When I fall down, she picks me up and dusts me off, and we carry on. And before that, I never had very good relationships. It may sound phony, but she's a person that I depend on very much. I won't tell her to her face.
Is she listening to you now?
Yeah. She's probably the first time she's heard this.
Oh. The whole point of these schools was ethnic cleansing, really, was to try and take away your culture, your background. And I wondered if you'd just talk to me about what you're most proud about your culture, your heritage, and where you come from.
I've been able to go out over the years and look over the land and understand how beautiful our life was. My people consider themselves the star people, and we have ceremonies based around constellations of stars. We have kinship laws that are beginning to resurface. We have community functions. People are starting to get that respect back, that traditional respect, that cultural respect. We still believe in the Creator. Every day, even this morning up at 5:30, the first thing I do is I pay homage to the Creator for everything, for my life, for my children, for my grandchildren, for how we are living. I thank the Creator for that. And to me, it's important that my grandchildren are learning this language back. And I thank the community where they attend school for teaching them that. I wish I could. All I can do is just drive them back and forth, right?
It must be fantastic to have grandchildren and be able to pass on the things that you've learned as well.
Oh, and little things, they just latch onto my legs. They won't let go now. It's just, I must have done something right. Sometimes we go out in the bush and we shoot ducks and we cook them over an open fire and we have a little snack in the bush and, all the plants that they're supposed to pick and why they're supposed to pick them and how to use them and do all them things that grandparents are supposed to do.
Barry, thank you so much for speaking to me. I'm incredibly grateful, and I know our audience will be as well. Thank you so much.
For those all that are listening, I want to give a special thanks to everybody for giving me this honor. And to me, it's an honor to speak on behalf of my friends, my fellow survivors, the ones that didn't survive, like to speaking on their behalf. I thank you so much. And when it's my turn to go, I just hope I see all my friends.